Many thanks to Messen Video, who's been working hard to create this 2-minute video from the millions of hours of all the research and hard work done. So we'd like to thank them. I can't mention everyone, but thanks to all of the partners who have enabled us to put in place this scientific role. The Foundation, the Maurice Salvin, Pasteur Foundation, Princess of Monaco Foundation, and many, many more. So we're going to get into the heart of the subject. We have prepared, together with the scientific committee, this conference for you. Big thanks to Philippe Riefman, Laurent Vidal, and Rana Karouf for all the hard work done together with the students. So on the way to work today, I was surprised to bump into somebody.
Qui fonde Sciences Po en 1872 avec Henri Dunant, qui n'est que de 7 ans son cadet, et qui, à la suite du traumatisme du champ de bataille,
following the Solferino battle, started
quels que soient les pays du monde, et le
the Red Cross movement.
Qu'aurait-il à se dire ce 26 octobre?
One is convinced that the students have to be aware of the contemporary situation. Those who are crazy enough to change the world will manage to do that. And this belief is still firmly held today. And the humanitarian movement has grown considerably since then. I think he would be worried to see the situation by the 21st century with all the cruel wars and conflicts, but I think he would be also pleased and proud to see us all together, and he would encourage us to continue to work together within our societies around this principle of humanitarian aid. We are continuing to be creative and productive. And for 10 years, we have played our role in reinforcing this position, creating new bridges as well, and continuing to strengthen the links between the social actors and humanitarian actors. 10 years on, we are proud of the work that our teams have done, and we can see that this relationship works.
À partir d'un dialogue réinventé, elle propose des pistes concrètes et qui ne sont pas forcément coûteuses. D'ailleurs, on aimerait bien qu'elle
We would like to make some savings, of course.
Quantifier tout ça. Elle explore les angles morts et porteuse de solutions durables et éthiques et peut même se déployer en temps de crise.
This can be done in times of crisis, of course. Humanitarian translation is a notion that came up at the beginning of our foundation. The World Summit, the first of the United Nations on that subject, was just starting along this path. It's since then become the first postdoctorate subject, looking in detail at the role of humanitarian stakeholders. And it insists on the importance of accompanying scientific researchers, and on the other hand, by the way of integrating ethical subjects within our research. It's quite simple. The world is moving faster and faster, thanks to our interdependencies and our technology. Humanitarian work are on the front line of these changes. Populations are fragile and vulnerable. How can organizations continue to work? Sometimes there's over €1 billion of spending in their operational costs. How can they continue in this way? Their economic model does not enable them to invest in the way that they need, and certainly compared to the private sector, it's not sufficient. Creating this foundation was a clear consequence of this transition. We want a society which is able to anticipate, and a foundation which is able to satisfy the needs of those most vulnerable.
Du XXIe siècle n'étaient pas seulement les témoins d'évolution, comme cela a été le cas tout au long des crises et guerres du XXe siècle,
Wars of the 20th century have really changed the way the sector works. And we now see a completely new paradigm with this new reconfiguration after the reform of the United Nations in 2005. We can see greater humanitarian aid, that is for sure, and we've seen that recently. We also have new stakeholders on the scene during crises. We have humanitarian economy with its chain of subcontracting, which is unfortunately in place, and that has changed a lot of the situation. Do our organizations have the capacity to manage this and to negotiate proactively our own place in this chain to help national societies, whether it be for Black Lives Matter or for the Me Too movement? We also have COVID, which came on the scene. We have the climate crisis too, the destruction of biodiversity, bringing on increased pressure that we are seeing more and more today, certainly concerning water sovereignty. Armed conflicts have also made things much worse.
Du droit international humanitaire, révélatrice pour Didier Fassin d'une crise des relations internationales. Comme ce dernier l'explique au collège.
It was said recently that these conflicts are describing a crisis that we haven't seen before.
Le sociologue rappelle également dans quelle mesure
this hard work has
de prendre en compte son propre ethnocentrisme. Avec transition humanitaire, nous avons donc décidé
we have tried to move forward as we can. It's a question of excluding as few people as possible and to use concepts for export rather than simply relying continually on models. We also have to find ways to enable our searchers to be greater involved and to participate more.
Il n'était pas certain que l'action humanitaire soit un objet de recherche pour les sciences sociales dans tous les pays où nous souhaitons travailler. Et en effet,
and it's been important for us to open up, to break down walls.
Aller repérer les laboratoires et disciplines qui s'en emparent et changent d'un pays à l'autre. Droit, sociologie, sciences politiques,
looking at the science of the environment in greater detail. But it's not a question of looking in the main capital cities, but also in the regions, the different towns and universities that are outside of our capital.
Nous nous sommes détachés de l'observation de la crise humanitaire pour laisser aux chercheurs le choix des relations, des phénomènes sociaux ou des situations à étudier et permettre de reconnecter l'objet humanitaire non pas au seul nexus prôné par nos champs professionnels de la paix ou de développement, mais aussi aux normes, aux acteurs et pratiques de l'action sociale, aux politiques publiques et à d'autres objets qui nous ont nous-mêmes étonnés comme
citizenship is important for us.
les biens intimes. Par ailleurs,
with this in mind, each research has to include recommendations, those built together with humanitarian stakeholders. And one thing that we can confirm is that a more inclusive research and more diverse research will go to help a greater number of people. This will give us greater focus in the work that we have to do.
Deuxième temps, il a fallu s'assurer que les résultats diffusent, les décliner, les traduire, les confronter à nos publics, notamment à travers la revue alternative humanitaire cofondée avec nos collègues de
We work together with Médecins du Monde, Handicap International, and Actions Against Hunger. Humanitarian transition is 25 projects in 13 countries in Africa, Lebanon, and overseas French departments. Madagascar as well, where we can see the role of NGOs is absolutely key.
Ainsi que des réflexions sur les personnels des ONG, personnels locaux, personnels internationaux.
Humanitarian transition is a number of conferences around the world, thanks to help from the overseas ministry. And this includes those in Ivory Coast, Madagascar, Kenya, who have organized meetings together with us. I'd like to take that opportunity to thank them. We have the Cartala edition, which has been very fruitful. We've been waiting for this for a number of years, and that's the one of Cameroon. And this came out just yesterday, so I'd like to take the opportunity to thank our colleague Marie-Thérèse Manguet, the professor, and all those who wrote in this book from Cameroon. And it was difficult to do given the COVID
C'était aussi
pandemic.
académique, ça a été en fait, ça a été un peu mix. Mais tout cela, en
All
fait,
this
n'est
is
pas
not
suffisant.
sufficient, of course.
Les résultats ne créent pas forcément le changement si ceux qui s'en ont pas n'ont ni pouvoir
We
ni
cannot
ressources.
reach results if we do
Et
not
si
have
la
the right
formulation des
resources.
questions de recherche n'est pas assez participative.
And we have to ensure that our research
Ces
is
derniers
more
mois, nous avons donc
participative.
travaillé tant au
So we've been
processus d'émergence des
looking
questions de recherche
recently at
sociales,
these points with
que
the
sur la
researchers.
transformation des résultats en innovation sociale, en les mettant à l'épreuve des contextes.
And these new subjects are being tested in the new social forum in which we are living today.
De vous présenter aujourd'hui son essentiel scientifique. Alors,
I also have this book. It's crazy to imagine the two have come out on the same day. It's wonderful. Here's the second.
Nous y avons concentré en 170
So here are
pages
72 pages of the lessons learned from the last 10 years. We've
Nous y avons
brought together
rassemblé
all
toute
our
notre
community of researchers,
de
governance,
gouvernance, nos experts associés, nos
experts,
équipes
young
de recherche,
people,
des écoles,
volunteers,
pour vous donner envie d'aller
to
plus loin.
encourage you to go a little bit further.
C'est déjà
And this
accessible
document is
avec
still
le QR code.
is available on the scan code that you will be able to benefit from.
Comment on va dire?
You'll be able to scan that on your telephones and access the 72 pages.
Les ouvrages sont aussi dans vos sacs, hormis pour nos collègues de la Croix-Rouge, parce qu'on va organiser un lancement en décembre sur le campus à Montrouge.
So the English version will be also available by the month of November. So the foundation is continuing to work hard. Your commitment, however, is absolutely key, and we need this to continue. So, but this is an emotional moment, and we're going to hand over to our speaker for this morning, Professor Minister, as well. You don't like long presentations, I know, but there is a certain story here.
Celle d'un cheminement par la médecine et l'enfant qui conduit à la génétique et qui soulève l'éthique. Le parcours politique et le tournant humanitaire qui vous propulse en plein tsunami, puis Haïti au cœur des catastrophes.
You have seen so many terrible conflicts over the years, in the last 10 years. We also have perspectives of peace on the horizon. I'd like to remind that you are also co-founder of the Humanitarian Review, a really unique bridge across worlds. And you always have this will to place the human being at the center. Many thanks. I'd like to invite you up to speak. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to hold back the emotion, because after all these speeches that we've heard this morning, it will be difficult. Given the strong links that we have, I'd like to thank all the authorities who are here with us that have already spoken, notably presidents of the French Red Cross. It's a real pleasure to be together again. It's difficult for somebody who's not from Paris to see, to have a position that he has had when one is not in the capital, but it's something that has to be done. This contact enables us to maintain the momentum that we've always had. So you have chosen humanitarian transition. This is your subject. And I'd like to remind you, first of all, that literally a transition is the passage from one state to another. And given that we are constantly seeking to adapt to the constant evolution of our environment, we are ourselves in constant transition. However, by studying the successive transitions in humanitarian action, most often during severe crises, we can better understand and even anticipate how ideas and strategies
précédents.
evolve over time.
Alors
So
tout commence
it all
par
began
la
with medicine,
médecine,
and
plus
more
précisément la
specifically,
médecine
medicine
de
during
guerre.
war
En
periods.
effet, la
So
création du
Henri
mouvement
Dunant
Croix-Rouge à
founded the
l'initiative
Red
d'Amérique
Cross
du
movement
Nord
in
en
1859
1859
to
est
help the
devenu
wounded
devenir en
during the
outre
Battle of
l'essai
Solferino.
de la bataille de Solferino. Je précise cela pour insister sur le fait
I say
que
this
la
to emphasize
préoccupation
that
première
primary
fut bien de
concern was to provide
soigner
care
et
and
de
relief
soulager
in
les
the actual
prisonniers
combat zone.
de combat.
But it should
Il
be
faut
remembered
aussi rappeler
that
qu'ayant
having
mobilisé
mobilized
les
the women
femmes des
of the
villages
surrounding
environnants,
villages, who
les
were more inclined to look after
coéquipiers
their own,
des leurs,
Dunant went
Dunant
around the
parcourait
battlefield
le champ de
shouting,
bataille en
Tutti
hurlant Tutti
fratelli,
fratelli,
they are all
nous sommes
brothers,
tous frères,
reminding the women
rappelant à ces
that
femmes que
all the
tous les
combatants had the
combattants
same
avaient les mêmes
rights,
droits aux soins, quel que
the
soit
same
leur
rights to
rang.
healthcare,
Il
whatever side they
s'agissait
were on.
d'hommes
This was about
et de
people
leur
and
humanité
their common humanity.
commune. Au
In the
commencement, il
beginning, the
était
aim
question de
was to
sauver
save
les vies,
lives, all
toutes
lives,
les vies, notamment
particularly in times
pendant
of
la
war.
guerre.
This
Cette
explains
précision permet d'ailleurs de
why
comprendre
the
pourquoi
first Red
la
Cross
première
Society,
société de la
which
Croix-Rouge,
was founded
créée en
in
France
France
en
in
1864,
1864,
avait été
was called
baptisée
the
Société de
Société de
secours aux
Secours
blessés
aux Blessés
militaires.
Militaires, Company
C'est dire le
for
rôle
first
majeur
aid
de la
for
médecine et des
military
soignants, le
wounded.
plus
This is a
souvent
clear indication of the major
mobilisés
role
par la
played by medicine and
catastrophe,
medical staff who are most
naturelle,
often mobilized during
épidémie ou
natural
encore
disasters,
famine.
like the
Il s'agit
epidemics
bien
or
d'une
famines. This
urgence.
was indeed
La
an emergency
mobilisation
requiring
immédiate pour permettre de
immediate
soigner les
mobilization to treat the
blessés
wounded
et
and to
sauver des
save
vies.
lives.
Il
It
faut
should also
aussi
be emphasized
souligner
that this
que
mission
cette mission
requires
repose sur des
specific
compétences
first aid,
particulières de
nursing,
premiers secours,
and medical
de
skills.
soins infirmiers et médicaux.
I stress
J'insiste
the
sur
word
les
skills
compétences
because
car
they
elles
naturally
trouvent
have their
naturellement
place
leur place
in the event of a
quand
crisis,
crise et
and no
personne
one
ne
would
viendra
question
discuter du
the
bon fondé
validity of
de
their
leur
action.
action. C'est d'ailleurs pour
It's
cette
for this very
raison que
reason
des
that
ONG
health
très
NGOs
réputés
such as
comme
Doctors
Médecins
Without
sans
Borders
frontières
continue to
continuent
operate
d'agir
without
sans susciter
being
de
challenged
protestation car
because their
leurs
skills
compétences viennent
fill a clear
pallier
gap
un manque
and
et sont
are
les bienvenus.
welcome. However,
Pour autant, je
as
n'ai
I came
pas
to
encore eu
understand more
l'occasion du
clearly
terrible
during the
tsunami de
terrible tsunami
2004
of
dans le sud-est
2004 in
asiatique.
Southeast Asia,
Après
once
avoir
we have
soigné
treated the
les victimes
victims
et leur
and
avoir
enabled them
permis
to
de
survive,
survivre,
should
faut-il
we consider
considérer que
humanitarian
l'action
action to be
humanitaire s'est
over?
terminée? Un
A
coup
short
d'échange avec
conversation
la
with a
femme d'un
fisherman's wife
pêcheur
on the
fait
shore of
repérage de
Sumatra
Sumatra
opened up
m'a
new
ouvert de
horizons.
nouveaux horizons. En
So
clair,
she
elle
said
m'a
to me,
dit:
I've
j'ai
lost my
perdu
husband,
mon mari,
my children,
mes enfants,
my whole
toute
family.
ma famille.
I've lost my
J'ai
house
perdu ma maison
and all
et
my
tous mes
possessions.
biens.
You've
Je vous
saved
ai
my
sauvé la
life,
vie.
but what am I going to
Mais
do
que
with my
vais-je
life
en
now?
faire maintenant?
It was at that
À ce
very moment
moment précis,
I realized
j'ai
that
réalisé
having made it
qu'après avoir
possible to
permis de
survive,
survivre,
the
la
task was
tâche
not
n'était pas
sufficient, it was not
terminée.
complete.
Il fallait
You had to
aussi
also
permettre de revivre, ce qui ouvrait de nouvelles
create these
possibilités
new
immenses,
prospects
mais
that were
indispensables.
essential but also
La Croix-Rouge
immense. And the
française,
French Red
contrairement
Cross
à d'autres consacrées seulement à l'urgence, la
therefore
Croix-Rouge
remained.
française est donc restée
And in those
de
long
longs
months,
mois dans les
in these
pays
effective
touchés pour
countries, they
aider à
stayed to help
aménager
create
le
the
cadre
framework
d'une nouvelle
for
vie
a new life
avec la
with the
construction de
construction of
logements,
housing,
d'écoles, de
schools,
centres de
health
santé,
centers, and
mais
also the
aussi le
development of
développement
income
d'activités
generating
génératrices de
activities.
revenus.
For
Nous avons
example,
acheté
we
des
bought
machines à coudre,
sewing
des fours
machines,
de
bakers'
boulanger,
ovens, we
rénové
renovated
des
fish
bassins de
farms.
pisciculture endommagés.
So the ultimate
But
aim
l'ultime
is
était
to
d'agir
was to ensure
en
that
sorte que les
the victims of
sinistrés
this
puissent
disaster could once
redevenir le
again take
plus
charge of
vite
their
possible
lives as quickly as
les
possible.
acteurs de leur propre vie.
This is
C'est ce
what
que
I
j'ai
call
appelé l'humanitaire
sustainable
durable,
humanitarianism,
car la
because the
principale
main innovation
nouveauté après
after
l'urgence est
emergency
l'action
is
sur le long
long-term
terme.
action.
C'est pour
It was to
décrire et
describe and
développer
develop this
ce
concept
concept
that I
que j'ai
wrote
écrit l'urgence
What
humanitaire
Happens Next
terrible.
After Humanitarian Emergency.
Convoqué par la Cour des comptes pour m'en expliquer,
When I was invited by
avais-je
the
bien
Court of Auditors
utilisé
to
les
explain
mots
my work, I received the
donnés en
unanimous
urgence?
approval of our
Eh bien,
commissioners who
j'ai reçu
felt that it was
l'assentiment unanime
logical
des commissaires,
that
trouvant
in addition
logique
to
qu'en
the
lien avec
emergency and
l'urgence et
following
sa
on from it,
suite,
a
une
more
action
sustainable
plus
form
durable
of
prenne
action
sa
should take its
place
place
pour donner tout son sens
to give
à
the company its
l'entreprise.
full meaning.
Voilà pour la
So
transition
much for the
vers
transition to
l'action
sustainable humanitarian action.
durable. Depuis, les
It's
mentalités ont
interesting to note
évolué
that
au plan
after another
international,
tsunami in
car
2017
il est intéressant de noter
in
qu'après un
Indonesia this
autre
time,
tsunami en 2017,
they
l'Indonésie a
said that it was
déclaré
waiting for
attendre les
international
ONG
NGOs,
internationales.
not so much
Moins
for the
pour
emergency
l'urgence
aid, but
que
more for the
pour des
long-term
partenariats
partnerships.
inscrits dans la durée.
To reinforce my
Pour
point,
conforter
I would
mon
like to
propos,
remind you
je rappelle qu'une
that a
grande
major
ONG ayant
NGO having
parfaitement intégré
perfectly
cette dimension
integrated this
humanitaire
is called
s'appelle
the
l'URD,
URD,
pour
which
urgence,
is
réhabilitation,
stands for
développement.
Emergency
C'est bien
Rehabilitation
la
and Development.
transition
This is the transition
humanitaire
to
durable.
sustainable humanitarianism. It
Mais
was
c'est dans
in
la
the
mise en œuvre
implementation
de
of
cette
this
humanitaire
sustainable
durable que se sont
humanitarianism that the
manifestées
first
les
demands,
premières
if not the first
revendications et
criticisms,
les premières
emerged
critiques
in the form of
sous
thoughts
la forme de
such as the
réflexions
following.
telles que: pourquoi est-ce que c'est vous
Why
qui
do
gérez
you
plutôt
manage
les
these
sommes
sums of money
d'argent
coming from
provenant des
donations that
dons
is intended
qui sont
to
destinés
help
à
us?
nous aider? Pourquoi est-ce
Why
vous
are
qui
you
dirigez
the ones who are
plutôt
in
les
charge of what needs to
actions
be
à
done?
entreprendre?
Why aren't
Pourquoi
we
ne sommes-nous
more
pas
involved
davantage
in choosing
impliqués dans le choix
priorities
des
when we are
priorités
talking about our
lorsqu'il s'agit
lives
de nos vies,
and those
de
of our
celles de nos
families on our
familles,
land?
sur nos terres?
Aren't
Ne
we
sommes-nous
the ones
pas,
in the best
nous,
positions
les mieux
to
placés
know what we
pour
need
savoir
and
ce
how
dont
to go
nous
about
avons
getting it?
besoin et comment œuvrer à leur réalisation? Mon
My
attention
attention had
a
often
souvent été
been drawn to
saisie par
these
ces
issues
questions
in a number
dans
of different
nombre de
situations
situations diverses
and
et dans
in a
plusieurs
variety of
pays.
different countries. I really felt
J'ai
the need
vraiment
to
ressenti
react
la
when I first
nécessité de
read
réagir
Haiti's main
à la
newspaper, which was
lecture
called
du
Le
principal
Nouveliste.
journal
And that was
d'Haïti,
just a
Le
few weeks
Nouvelliste,
after the
quelques
earthquake that
semaines
hit
après le
in
tremblement de terre
2010.
de
So
2010.
its front
Il
page
titrait
headline
en
read
première page
Haiti, the
Haïti,
Republic
la
of
République des
NGOs.
ONG. Et l'article n'était pas
And the
particulièrement
article was not
confortant.
particularly comforting.
Au fur et à
In the course of my
mesure
many
des nombreux
interviews with a
entretiens
number
avec des
of leading
personnalités
Haitian
haïtiennes
figures,
pour
I realized that
réaliser
what the victims
ce que
were asking
demandaient les
for,
populations victimes,
beyond
au-delà de
aid
l'aide,
itself, was
était la
recognition for their
reconnaissance
work,
de leur autonomie retrouvée, la
also
recherche d'une
recognition for their
véritable
newfound autonomy,
bienfaisance
the search for
et non
true
la
benevolence,
malfaisance
and not the all too
trop
frequent
fréquente pour eux et leurs
non-benevolence
familles.
for them and their
Cela
families.
en toute
And
équité.
this is what they were looking
Ces
for in all
questions que
fairness. The
regrettaient mes
situations that
interlocuteurs
my
étaient
interviewees
vraiment
regretted
convaincantes.
were truly
Par
convincing.
exemple,
For example,
il
they
soulignait
pointed
que
out
les
that the
centres
free
de
health
santé
centers
gratuits
run by
des
NGOs
ONG
were
faisaient de
competing
la
unfairly with
concurrence
Haitian
déloyale
doctors
aux
who
médecins
were
officiels
continuing
qui
to
refusaient
practice
d'exercer en
independently.
libéral.
So this
Et cette
remark led
remarque
us
nous a
to
conduits
close
à
our own
fermer
limits,
nos propres consultations pour nous
join
insérer
the
dans les
existing
centres de
public health
santé
sectors
publics
already run by
dirigés
the
par les
Haitians.
Haïtiens eux-mêmes. Je
I
pourrais
could give
développer
another
d'autres
number of
exemples
other
de malfaisance non
examples of
voulue de notre population en
non-intended
temps réel.
poor
Ce
actions.
faisant, dans leurs demandes, je retrouvais presque à
I found
l'identique
that their
celles de nos
requests were
patients
almost identical to
hospitalisés
those of my
en
patients
santé
in
publique.
hospital or in consultations.
Ils
They were
exprimaient que
expressing the view
l'asymétrie, l'apostrophe
that this
asymétrie, dans la
asymmetry in the
relation
relationship between
entre
the
le
doctor and
médecin et le
patient was
patient
no
n'était
longer
plus acceptable.
acceptable. The doctor
Le médecin,
who is there,
debout,
who knows and who
sachant,
decides,
décidant,
alongside a patient who is
était
lying down
parfois
horizontal, who is
couché,
ignorant and simply
ignorant
waiting.
et attendant.
The
Les
demands of
demandes des
patients
patients
therefore
ont
prompted
suscité une
ethical
réflexion
reflection
éthique
to
pour
come up with the
dégager
answers
les
that
réponses que
medical
l'éthique
ethics
médicale pouvait
maybe could
apporter.
provide. This
Elles ont
led to
conduit
the
à
adoption
l'adoption d'une
of
loi
the
numéro
law of 4th of
199 sur
March
le droit des
2002 on
malades
patients' rights.
et j'ai trouvé
But I
que
found that
de
the
mêmes
same
situations
asymmetrical situation
asymétriques
could exist
pouvaient
between aid
exister entre
workers
les
and the
humanitaires
populations they
et les
helped.
populations aidées.
From then on,
Désormais, j'étais
I was
vraiment
truly convinced
persuadé que
that
l'éthique
ethics
devait
should also
s'appliquer
apply to
aussi à
humanitarian aid,
l'humanitaire,
particularly
notamment
in
dans
sustainable
l'action
action.
durable.
The four
Les
principles of
quatre
ethics were
principes de
clearly
l'éthique avaient
asserted:
assez clairement revendiqué
autonomy,
l'autonomie, la
benevolence,
bienfaisance, la non-malfaisance
non-maleficence, and
et
equity.
l'équité.
For the
Pour
humanitarian
l'humanitaire,
sector,
c'était
this was a
une
new
nouvelle transition,
transition,
la
what we can
transition
call
éthique.
ethical transition. It was with this in mind that I wrote the humanitarian sector being tested by ethics. This is why, in order to harmonize attitudes, it has proved useful to bring together all French NGOs on a regular basis for 2 or 3 days to share experiences, initiatives, results, and new or persistent questions. This led to the creation of the Humanitarian Forum, which takes place every 18 to 24 months in Annecy, thanks to the support of the Mérieux Foundation. The theme of the last Humanitarian Forum in March 2022 was the following: the New Deal in the humanitarian sector, continuities, impasses, and adaptation. You can see we were at the heart of the subject on this. 2 points still needed to be explored in greater depth. Firstly, the need for our support, and secondly, how do we pass the baton onto them? As far as meaning was concerned, it was a natural choice. If the aim really was to restore them to the role of actors of their own lives, we had to focus more on resilience. I know that this word resilience is often poorly used, but when we do look at it and we go back to the source of the term resilience, we can see that it involves 4 successive stages, and very precise stages. Number 1, survival. This is the emergency. Number 2 is adapting, post-emergency. Number 3 is bouncing back. This is the return to autonomy. And number 4, finally, strengthening. That's to say, taking the necessary steps to ensure that we're better protected in the face of any potential new ordeals that may arise. So once again, survival, adapting, bouncing back, and strengthening, that's resilience. It's interesting to note that these stages are necessarily part of a long-term process. We have the transition towards resilience as well as ethics. And finally, with regard to the transfer of responsibilities, there are 2 questions that have to be answered. Number 1, how can we share experience, lessons learned, achievements, and difficulties? That's the first question. And how can we prevent the few initiatives we have from being handed over to the only journals published in the United States? Well, to answer the first question, in the absence of any existing tools, in 2016 we created a bilingual humanitarian magazine, English and French, designed to share experiences and thoughts on both fundamental and topical issues. So the name of the magazine is Humanitarian Alternatives, and edition 23 has just come out, and I think, modestly, that it's a real success. A few of the examples of topics covered will give you an initial idea of the magazine. Ebola, the end of the nightmare. That's one. Another, why should COVID not be seen as a humanitarian emergency? Another one is mental health, from awareness to practice. And in the latest issue, number 23, the cover is International Humanitarian Law, the Great Comeback. Or is it something that's going backwards? We can see that the subjects here are key, and they are subjects that motivate us too. The second question also concerns the training of local humanitarian stakeholders. Who should we hand over the baton to? This is why we have to work together in priority. And it's when we saw that it was necessary 10 years ago to create the French Red Cross Foundation, which Virginie Trois will talk to you with her experience and skills. And she is the linchpin of the foundation. It's the transition also of training. Over the last 10 years, the foundation has established itself as a very useful tool for helping to train people in countries involved in humanitarian action. It has also become involved in social action. Humanitarian aid, just like medicine, encompasses the whole range of medical and social services which combine cure and care.
Où s'associe le cure et le care, c'est-à-dire le soin et le prendre soin.
So it goes without saying that this evolution over time, almost 20 years since 2004, has been a permanent transition from emergency humanitarian aid to sustainable humanitarian aid, from the introduction of ethics to the search for real autonomy for affected populations so that they can take their lives back into their own hands. It is to be hoped that these efforts to adapt and this quest for autonomy for the populations concerned will not suffer too much from the new geopolitical climate in Africa. 10 years on, we have seen the path that we have taken. And I say a big well done to all of you. Once again, it's hoped that these effects of these efforts will not suffer too much from the new geopolitical climate in Africa. New transition will undoubtedly have to be led and assumed, one that is both urgent and difficult. It may also be mentioned by other speakers today at the ensuing discussions. So that is the message that I wanted to share with you. This message is essentially one of thanks. Thanks to the French Red Cross, the Federation. You have ensured so much, but we are never really fully prepared for what life throws at us. I thought that I could be used to facing death, but it is not something. I discovered that is not something that we can simply accept, and that we are never prepared for that. Also, we are not prepared for these families torn apart, these life-changing disasters. And I feel that I found in the Red Cross movement the most wonderful years of my life, enabling me to be useful, at least a little bit. So I'd like to say to you thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you all continue to work hard. This foundation really has proven its worth, and I am sure that you will help to continue it to grow and to be continually efficient.
We will start the round table based on the last shifts that have experienced the humanitarian sector, whether they were exogenous or endogenous. We would like to shed new light on the dynamics. We also would like to get back on this intention by the United Nations to localize humanitarian aid. Would like to mention new international standards and practices. And we also would like to question to what extent the humanitarian sector is moving forward based on the humanitarian crisis that we have experienced, and whether the whole humanitarian ecosystem is moving forward to a more coherent and consistent pattern. So we invited 4 professionals from the sector who are ready to share their thoughts. We have about 1 hour and a half together. I think we can start with the first introduction, 5 minutes each. Every speaker will introduce themselves and will share their own point of view. We actually launched the humanitarian transition outlook. However, it is interesting to see how you, from your perspective, see this transition. We will start with Professor Dorothea Hilhorst.
Alors, professeur Hilhorst,
Dorothea,
vous êtes
you
professeur en aide humanitaire et reconstruction
are
à
a sociologist, a professor
l'Université
of
Erasmus de Rotterdam.
humanitarian studies, humanitarian aid and reconstruction, actually.
Du prix honorifique de la Fondation. Vous avez
You
travaillé
have
autour de
worked
nombreuses crises humanitaires
on
dans différents
different
contextes,
crisis sectors in Ethiopia, in Asia,
efficacité de
emergency
l'urgence,
ecosystems in
Haïti,
Angola,
Rwanda.
Haiti,
Vous avez
Rwanda.
effectué aussi de nombreux terrains.
You also
Vos
worked on
compétences
field
prouvent bien
studies,
que la résilience locale,
especially
on en parlait
specifically
justement,
on
face au
food
changement
system
climatique,
resilience
et
based on
d'initiatives
climate change,
communautaires pendant la pandémie
as well
Covid-19.
as
Alors vous avez une
community-based work during
perspective
COVID-19
sociologique
crisis.
qui met l'accent sur
You
l'impact
have
de l'aide
this
humanitaire
sociology
citoyenne des
approach
personnes, des organisations et des
working
communautés.
on how
Et vous êtes
communities
aussi
work together
présidente de
in
l'International
face of
Humanitarian
crisis.
Studies
You're also the president
Association.
of the
C'est un
International
réseau
Humanitarian
qui réunit
Studies
environ 400
Association.
chercheurs travaillant
This
sur les crises humanitaires.
IHSA
Vous êtes donc
gathers
un poste
a network
d'observation
of
privilégié pour nous livrer vos
humanitarian
témoignages. You speak and
stakeholders.
understand French beautifully,
You
but feel free to
speak
switch
and
to
understand
English.
French,
Et
but
pour les
please
personnes
feel free to
francophones, non anglophones dans la salle,
listen
branchez-vous donc sur
to
Zoom sur le canal de traduction.
feel free to speak in French or English during your presentation.
Merci. Merci beaucoup, Virginie.
Thank you very much, Virginie.
Avant que je commence avec
Before moving forward with my personal presentation, I would like to congratulate Red Cross movement. I'm struggling to believe that you've only working on this for the last 10 years because the number of achievements and publications is amazing. I'm just giving the example of this book here. It's really impressive. Congratulations for all the work that you have done. As Virginie said, I can speak French. I don't know, however, whether it's better for you to listen to my English or to my French presentation. I don't know exactly. I'll try in French and we'll see. What I would like to emphasize is the collaboration between humanitarian stakeholders, but also national governments, international institutions. When we talk about humanitarian transition, we should more specifically say that national governments are struggling in coping with crisis situations. There is a big difference between humanitarianism being led based on social and economic situations. It's important to bear in mind the socio-economic aspect when carrying out humanitarian actions. As an example, in my humanitarian governance, is my French all right, or should I switch to English? Sorry, I'm not very comfortable, but just let me know if it's not clear. So as I was saying, in the program I'm working on in Ethiopia, Angola, and Colombia, we work on humanitarian governance. In Ethiopia, government is quite strong. We could even say that it's quite authoritative. Ethiopia is a poor country. We're facing a variety of issues. However, we have another country where the government is not strong at all. And in our third country, Colombia, institutions are well developed, facilities are well developed, civil societies is pretty well organized. The socio-economic aspect is completely different. And based on the different contexts, we need to adapt. We need to make humanitarianism a variety, a whole ecosystem of options to make sure that we adjust our humanitarian action from one country to another. We tend to think humanitarian aid as an international system because this is how international aid has been developed. However, it's important to switch from an international scale to a local scale. And it's important for decision makers, but also for operators. By joining today's conference, I thought about humanitarian transition, and I actually realizing that we're not seeing many new movements, many new methodologies. In the Red Cross movement, the ICRC is seen as one of the leaders with a very strong international position. However, the federation, the International Federation, was already acting strongly. I personally worked more specifically with Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies. And there is a visible difference between IFRC's ways of working and national societies' way of adapting to the national governments, adapting to local communities, whether the move is more towards resistance or towards adoption of humanitarian aid. So when we talk about humanitarian transition, this is a key element to bear in mind. IFRC is a federation of national societies. And at the core of this federation are national societies with the mere definition of humanity, humanitarian aid, working with national stakeholders, depending on the different contexts and how they manage to answer international challenges on a local scale, based on their local context. Thank you very much, Dorothea. I would like to give the floor to Christine Nate. You are president of Burundi Red Cross for 2022. You've been volunteering for more than 15 years. You're a journalist. You have been committed in many solidarity actions throughout your career. You have led for 30 years a program called Dialogue with Children in Burundi in order to stand for children's rights in Burundi. So we usually call you Mother Sunday because your program was launched broadcasted every Sunday on the Burundi media. When we first met 2-3 years ago, you introduced me to your project on Hutu and Tutsi conflicts and your work with women, local women communities to rebuild solidarity move. You were part of the restructuring network of Red Cross Burundi to make sure that solidarity and humanitarian aid is visible no matter how difficult the context is. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say hi to everyone. Burundi National Society is at the crossroad of vulnerabilities based on ethnies and national classes. It has been a valuable testimony of all the difficulties and challenges that the country has faced. Red Cross Burundi is anchored in communities, and all their members have understood that solidarity is the key to rebuild the social fabric. For many years, we have understood that links and relationships and solidarity is a fundamental principle to make sure that we build our future together and we repair the past. Our focus is to expand our action throughout the territory. However, the geopolitical situation was not easy. Burundi is one of the smallest countries in the world, but the most densely populated in the world. No matter how big the disasters are, the impact will be significant. This is why we decided to rebuild the humanitarian and solidarity sector based on grassroots actions. We had to face many obstacles. We had to be resistant and resilient, just like other national societies in the world. We had to rebuild our foundations in 2005 because our house, if I may say, was lacking building blocks. So we decided to rebuild the whole national society from scratch in order to adjust the Burundi situation and to make sure that we operate in parallel with national government institutions. We are part of a framework agreement with different ministry representatives in order to make sure that we take part of any intermediary and negotiating processes. On the operational level, we launched a campaign in 2013 which emphasizes an economic model and a growth model stemming in the grassroots action based in neighboring and district actions. As an example, I am part of the district committee and also part of the National Society. So this bottom to top movement is essential. We also launched another campaign that was dedicated to first aid training. Burundi has 2,930 hills, and we wanted to train each and every community living there. We wanted to popularize first aid education in order to make sure that everybody knows what to do in case of disaster. And this is not about education, this is about training. Burundi hosted different scales of disasters, but we all understand now, we all know that we shouldn't wait for the international aid. We should be able to provide first aid on our side autonomously as an autonomous Red Cross entity. And we gained so much autonomy when it comes to emergency response. This is explaining you all these campaigns. I would like to emphasize the way we have understand to how to resist to crisis and to build our own resilience. Burundi has been actively contributed to advocacy and advertising. However, Burundi is not in the spotlight of the media. We are a very quiet country. Our population is mostly not heard. However, we do face major disasters, natural disasters, landslides, heavy rains, floodings, affecting massively our farming structures, facilities, communities. Our local population cannot always face the situation by themselves. Some families are facing regular heavy rains, climate change effects affecting livelihoods and daily lives. Red Cross volunteers have contributed to building new housings with the local resources. They also have contributed to give food to people who were facing climate change impacts, heavy rains, or water stress conditions. So our key concept of resilience is more and more visible thanks to our teams and volunteers. Our local teams have highly educated the population on the notion of risk and resilience. And this is why our operational practices have improved so much. Within the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, we do have access to practices and norms. However, they are based on international standards. I'm talking about financial support, for example. These are based on international procedures. But it's important for us to have access to rapid aid. We sometimes we can see sometimes the discrepancy between the level of media coverage and the rapidity of the rapid access to financial supports. But so it is. We know that it exists now, these discrepancies between international and local scales. And we have to be aware that the challenges need to be overcome and need to be met. We have more than 680,000 volunteers in Burundi, which are spread on our 2,935 hills, as I said. And all our volunteers are spread throughout the territory. There are still some districts where we have roads, we have streets, but we don't have any signs, any traffic lights. And pupils going to school have to cross the road, for example, and the traffic is a complete nightmare. Trucks and cars are driving from one side to another side, and we have the luxury to have volunteers in place to help our pupils to go to school, to manage the traffic. And these volunteers are a great help for us to identify the vulnerable areas where we have to take measures. The National Geographic Institute of Burundi said that by next year, February, we will face heavy rains. And as I was mentioning, volunteers are also a key element, a key contributor to educate local population when it comes to climate change. So they are starting now to raise awareness and to teach and train our local population on what to do in case of heavy rains. As I said, I am also part of these volunteering teams, and I was, to give you a personal anecdote, I was working as a volunteer for the school pupils in my district, and I was late that day, and somebody called me, come on, please, Mama Dimanche, which is my nickname, Sunday Mama. Where were you this morning? You are late. We were waiting for you. And I was actually sad. I felt very bad to be 1 hour, 2 hours late, because for this reason, some children have been hurt and injured because of the traffic, heavy traffic on our roads. So it was just a personal anecdote to present you how important and impactful the volunteers' role is in our country. Thank you. Thank you very much, Christine. I think it's really important to emphasize this doubt shared on universal and local dimensions, this discrepancy between international standards and how they can be translated into localized actions. As you mentioned, we had to educate and to train people on what humanity means in the field, how we can institutionalize or formalize this humanity concept, and how we can translate it into actions on the local level. We are now moving forward to the West with Anissé. Anissé, you're a historian, lecturer. You were also one of the winners of our foundation's grant in 2018.
Merci Virginie. Bonjour à tout le monde.
Thank you, Virginie, and thank you all for welcoming me. It's another honor for me to be here with you. I would like to say hi to Francis Akindes, because it's a great honor to see him today. He's one of the best ambassadors of our University Alassane Ouattara in Bouaké, Côte d'Ivoire, and he's a great ambassador. He's a great, it's a great honor for me to see him today.
Saluer tous les participants. Alors, merci. Alors, pour comprendre les tissu associatif en Côte d'Ivoire, il faut peut-être regarder dans le rétroviseur. Enfin, je suis historien, donc très souvent, pour avancer avec mon véhicule, je regarde dans le rétroviseur parce que la trajectoire du projectile aussi dépend souvent de sa vitesse de départ. Donc, en Côte d'Ivoire, le tissu associatif
In the Ivory Coast, you can see after independence, we had a period of economic prosperity. It was considered as a miracle. So during this Ivorian miracle, we saw all this providence, populations being looked after, and there were not many NGOs who were working in health. They were considered more as international development organizations. So the first thing that really created this spontaneous number of NGOs was the AIDS crisis, which came in the 1980s. And that happened at the same time as an international economic issue, and that hit Ivory Coast really badly. And all the economic indicators were on red at that point. NGOs were created, and in 1997, out of 55 NGOs working in health, 13 of which were created before 1985, that's before the first official case of HIV, and 42 NGOs which were created after 1985. So that shows that it was the AIDS crisis which led NGOs to be interested in intervening in our country. That's the first key milestone. The second is the following. It was the military conflict of 2002. So from 2002, there was a coup d'etat, or an attempted one, and we had a divided country between East and West. And from then, the governmental actors, the doctors in the area occupied by the rebellion, and they moved, and the humanitarian actors took over to avoid a catastrophe. If we look at the numbers, we can see that from 1952 to 2002, the Ivory Coast had 515 different NGOs, but from September 2002 to 2003, there were 510 NGOs that were created. So just in that 1 year. So these are the two key crises which led to greater numbers of humanitarian actors. And then we had the conflict of 2011. The elected government back then sought to rebalance things, and the government brought in institutions to replace little by little the international humanitarian stakeholders. So the NGOs were encouraged to take their distance and be replaced by the governmental agencies, and that was generally, I wouldn't say it was hurried in, but it was brought in by the new government, who did not want their projects to be impeded. The Ivory Coast started to rebuild and put in place large infrastructure projects, and these NGOs took a step back. Ivory Coast was not affected by the Ebola outbreak, but it's more COVID, of course, that changed things. And this is where we saw the behavior of the NGOs locally. We could see that there were two different situations. Certain NGOs had completely vanished when the international stakeholders took a step back, as we said, in the 2010s. So those ones had completely disappeared. They no longer had any financing, of course. The second form, certain structures were still in place and had been there for a long time. and they were quite dynamic. Two examples: the Association of Christians for the Abolition of Torture during COVID benefited from a EU aid of 150,000 euros. And they worked hard against COVID in the different prisons and detention facilities, which of course overcrowded in the Ivory Coast, as you may know. So we really feared the worst. This organization trained all the socio-medical professionals within these detention centers, and also the detention centers for minors, and they distributed PPE. That was just one association. There was a second, which was one of Muslim women. They had 200,000 euros grant, helping women in vulnerable situations who had been hit by the lockdown brought in by COVID-19. They also helped with training as well. 750 women, therefore, benefited from this. These were women from underprivileged communities, not only in the capital of the Ivory Coast, but also other towns. And they were able to benefit from this. This included food kits as well as PPE, so there was a considerable budget put in place. Other NGOs in the past were real low cost, 5,000, 10,000, and here we're going up to 200,000, so you can see the difference. So these NGOs do benefit from more and more support from the Gulf states, or rather associations from the Gulf states who do finance the NGOs. We have the Association of Muslim Students of the Ivory Coast. So this humanitarian aid which came from the West, and sometimes from the EU, the United States, they were also competing with humanitarian aid coming from Asia and the Middle East. Just 1 minute to finish. So what is happening? Even if good things are being done, the NGOs are limited in their actions by a number of different factors. The first factor is the instrumentalization, the political using of the situations in COVID-19. We had political parties who were handing out kits with their logos on them. So that was competing against the humanitarian supply chain. So that's something that we saw during COVID-19. And they had greater weight in the community than the humanitarian movements. What else? We had a number of illegal NGOs. They pretend to be NGOs, but they are also working under the guise of a political party. After that, we had poor support from the Ministry of Health in the country. It was 230,000 euros per year for all health NGOs. That's the envelope was that small, and that was badly perceived by the population, especially given that we're in a context of crisis. So that was badly perceived. It's almost, people thought it was a Ponzi scheme. They didn't want to give money to local NGOs because they thought they were just making richer. So that made it difficult for the NGOs to raise money locally. So this meant that beyond crisis periods, NGOs were not able to put in place long-lasting programs. They also suffered from the rivalry between international NGOs. I've met myself some NGOs who say the following: we refuse to cooperate with certain international structures. We don't want financing from them because they work with somebody else. So it's that kind of political rivalry between NGOs. I'm going to stop there, I think, in my presentation.
dire que le potentiel existe.
We can say that the potential clearly exists. We have the human resources, we have credible NGOs, but behind that, we have to have the whole ecosystem, which is favorable to ensure that this is long-lasting. Many thanks. Given that to do all these analyses, you as a doctor, you don't spend all your time in the archives, and you are out in the field carrying out numbers of inquiries, investigations, and I'm sure that completes the historic information that we have already. Thank you very much, NEC. Moving on, let's move to philosophical science. Rio Chong, professor of philosophy, and you are co-director of the Center for Research in Ethics and vice president of the Canadian Philosophical Association. You've published a number of articles connecting ethics and health. In 2013, you worked together on a document called Ethics in International Relations, a document that I've used myself quite a lot. So following all these speeches, we can see that philosophy enables us on one hand to look at the question of universality, cosmopolitan aspects as well. So the ethics of international relations is key. And it enables us to analyze a whole load of different questions. It could be about war, justice, inequality. 2013 was an important year for you because this is when you went to Haiti. And that's quite surprising for a philosopher. So how does your discipline and your observations help us with our subject? First of all, I'm very honored and grateful to be invited to participate with all of you here today for this 10th anniversary of the foundation. Many thanks to Mr. Mattei, Madame Croix, and all the team for this wonderful welcome. I'd also like to say a word of thanks to all the people present who are out in the field. I am just a philosopher, and I have a certain inferiority complex here. I've always been the philosopher of each team, so it's a real honor to work together with people who work in the field. So you're right, 2013, 10 years ago, it was the date of the publication of this work. The title, once again, is International Ethics in International Relations. 2030 was the time, I remember. Well, I was working with Matthew Hunt, who is a physiotherapist who was interested in the ethical side of humanitarian aid. And 3 years after the terrible earthquake of Port-au-Prince, we went back into the field to do some qualitative research and carry out a number of interviews with local stakeholders who were in the field in the ensuing hours after the earthquake to get their perception of what was at stake, the benefits, the good practices, the challenges, the failures of the humanitarian response from that disaster. So as a philosopher, I try to develop the conceptual framework in which we work. So the first idea is to denaturalize natural disasters. And this term is used a lot in disaster studies. So the idea is to denaturalize these natural disasters. What does that mean? It's really to put into doubt the traditional question and to make humanitarian aid apolitical once again. It's a very complex network between the governments and the humanitarian stakeholders. We know that it's complex. There is a certain hierarchy that needs to be put in place and then to be respected. But sometimes these hierarchies reflect systematic inequalities. These may be economical or political reports, relationships. And one of the consequences of the systemic injustices is the following. It's simply the idea that these notions of equality or inequality are not only applied in the field, but also applied in the world of thinkers, of philosophers.
Sur la scène internationale, même en tant qu'acteurs humanitaires, qui sont ceux et celles dont la voix peine à se faire entendre parce que leurs témoignages et leur expertise locale sont discrédités pour toutes sortes de raisons, encore une fois, historiques, politiques, économiques.
So the idea, having met these colleagues in Haiti, including Jean-Hugues, the partners of Euromel, we were able to test out our ideas, and we realized the following.
Les déterminants sociaux de la santé, qui d'ailleurs est un paradigme théorique et pratique qui a été développé par le physiologiste français, le médecin français Louis Guilhermé.
Unfortunately, the level of sound is making things complicated for the interpreters. The sound is very low. We are on full volume here.
Qui détermine les inégalités de santé même à venir. Nous avons cru bon d'appliquer ce modèle-là pour essayer de comprendre.
We've been trying to understand the impact on health of the natural disaster. It could be those in Haiti, but also in Japan as well.
Possibilités de restructuration qui sont très différentes. Et en effet, les collègues, comme le rappelait Dr Mattei, les collègues haïtiens nous rappelaient à tous les jours qu'il y avait des formes de néocolonialisme de leur point de vue qui caractérisaient cette nouvelle république des ONG lorsque même avec les meilleures intentions du monde, évidemment, les acteurs internationaux de l'humanitaire
international aid players were coming on site to answer the population's needs. However, they faced a wide variety of problems and difficulties. For example, when the World Health Organization and the United Nations community asked to put in place these clusters meetings with their thematic meetings on water, resources, food systems, hygiene. So they tried to sort things out and to put in place very thematic meetings, very specific meetings, and they were carried out in English. And to be honest, Asian volunteers and Asian contributors could not really participate because most of our volunteers and most of our colleagues speak Creole or potentially French, but not English. And they couldn't really make their voices heard because of the language that was used during the UN meetings. And this is just an example of what was visible. We also faced historic lacks of justice. In Haiti, there was a revolution similar to the French one, and they fought for the independence and they fought against injustice. I worked more specifically on the structural consequences of these historical episodes, which triggered political and economic growth, as well as social movements. And we are trying to get these historical episodes into account in order to analyze ongoing injustice, which are part of the existing landscape where climate change crises will appear or are happening now. And this is why we see discrepancies between developed countries, what we call rich countries, and in developing countries. So they have to be taken into account when dealing with climate change impacts in developing countries. Thank you very much. As you can see, we ran over time. So maybe we should postpone question and answer session after the roundtable. What do you think, Mr. Chairman? Can we share questions now or? All right, so maybe we can share one more roundtable with our guests with regard to future. Maybe it's a good opportunity to wrap up this session with a more future-related viewpoint.
Et vous avez peut-être envie de partager
maybe it's the best time now to speak of the future and to share your recommendations with concrete examples, be it for the academic sector or the humanitarian action for decision makers. So I invite you to share your insights on the future, your ideas and suggestions or your point of view, because we in the humanitarian sector have to make sure that we know the upcoming challenges and we need to be able to anticipate obstacles and to be ready. Dorothea, maybe we can start with you again and follow the same order as previously. Thank you. Yes, thank you all for your contributions. It actually shed new light on the different context in Burundi, in other territories as well. I would like to get back to what I said because I spoke about a variety of humanitarianism. So what makes humanitarianism unique and as a single concept? It's quite an urgent question to answer. If you look at what's going on in Gaza Strip and between Israel and Gaza at the moment, it's important not to polarize and not to not to get confused. The humanitarian sector still have a lot to do in these situations. And we need to value their actions. This is why I would like to share with you a quote that I like from Thomas Mann from Magical Mountains, because he raised the question, what is humanitarianism? What is humanism, sorry? What is humanism? Humanism is the love of humanity, of humankind. And that's nothing more than this. So it's a political act. It's an act of rebellion against everything that can damage or that can hurt humanity. And this is precisely our common definition of humanitarianism. And this is what makes the link between us all among the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. It's our common cement, if I may say. And I'm very happy to be part of this cement, of this fabric. And I'm very enthusiastic and optimistic about future collaborations. Thank you, Dorothy. Who wants to share their thoughts afterwards? Rioa or Christine, maybe? Yes, thank you. We are talking about humanity, humankind, humanism. I think the key message here is our heart. We in Burundi Red Cross, we work at the heart of the communities. We are facing obstacles. We are facing, we need to ask for aids based on weather forecast and climate changes. However, our donors are tempted to highlight education and raising awareness actions because these are part of prevention campaigns, and prevention campaigns are less expensive than response. However, we need to mobilize resources to meet our challenges, to be able to answer their needs. So we shouldn't launch a humanitarian competition. We shouldn't forget local interests. We need to lead the Burundi growth in a consistent and resilient way, hand in hand with our public authorities. Humanitarian aid should not be theoretical anymore. It should be translated into professional training, priority coordination, and project management within the movement. As I said, Burundi Red Cross is managed from a grassroots approach. So we need to make sure that we concretely meet the local population's needs facing climate change. So for every initiative that is made by the French Red Cross, we completely rely on them and we trust them, and we trust public authorities as well. And we are still very optimistic to looking forward to building bridges with public authorities and public funds. We are contributing to this common effort within the 2030 agenda to localize humanitarian aid. But we need to make sure to stick to reality, to keep our bonds, to build our bonds with the local populations. And I'm convinced that together we will be able to fix these issues and to meet those needs. Thank you.
Merci, rapidement.
How can we reach this sustainable humanity, sustainable humanitarian sector? When we work with local NGOs, we should ask them whether sustainable development is coming first or not. Most of the time, international NGOs intervening in my country have led some effort for sustainable development because they were trained within the humanitarian sector. And unfortunately, a wide amount of new generation NGOs are not managed by people with humanitarian backgrounds. And this is something crucial. We need to train people. We can't work with donors and NGO managers that are only focusing on figures and statistics. Humanitarian emergency is not a job per se. It embraces a variety of training skills, of expertise. We need to give access to
est là, il fait un très bon boulot. Bon, je ne vais pas me lancer les fleurs moi-même. On a travaillé sur certaines questions. On a
In my
contacté les ONG,
teams,
mais
we
c'est
have
vrai,
developed
elles ont
very
resté parce que
specific
fait comme production en sciences sociales,
skills
très
to be
souvent
able
on
to
brasse
work with
l'argent et on dit beaucoup de choses pour rien de concret.
and
Donc,
national or
dans ces
international
conditions-là,
NGOs.
il n'y a pas un dialogue entre chercheurs
And
et
from our
praticiens de l'humanitaire
research
au niveau
perspective,
local. Il faut
we
donc
could
accentuer ces
develop
aspects-là
a
et bien
fruitful
entendu former et
dialogue with
encourager
humanitarian
ces
actors.
ONG-là. Il y
And
a
we
bien
need
sûr
to
des
develop
leaders
this
ici en
dialogue,
Côte
to
d'Ivoire
foster this
féminins
dialogue,
au
to make
niveau
sure
des
that
ONG.
we
Entre
speak
le
the same
département, la
language, we're on the same
cartographie à
page,
l'intérieur du pays,
and
quand
we
vous
make
voyagez
things
Poissy,
work together.
Korogo, ces grandes villes-là, vous voyez que les ONG qui sortent du lot, qui sont des emblèmes, ce sont des ONG dirigées par
Outstanding
des femmes
NGOs
qui
are
ont
mostly
un vrai
led
passé humanitaire, comme la
by
Croix-Rouge de Côte
women
d'Ivoire ou
who
d'autres.
have
Donc, ces
a
femmes, c'est
strong
un produit duel
background with
qui maîtrisent en fait
other
l'environnement de l'humanitaire.
humanitarian
Et il
aspects
faut
with
bien entendu
it
voir
could
comment
be
les pousser
hygiene,
vers
food
des filières
systems,
aussi
environment,
vers le haut.
and
C'est toutes ces
these
vertus qui naissent et qui sont beaucoup de
powerful
transfert. C'est ce
NGOs
que j'avais
should
pour
lead by example, should be valued and enhanced.
Oui, alors simplement pour conclure sur une touche prospective.
As you asked, I would like to also share my thoughts on the future and the prospects. 20 years ago, political and ethical aspects were the priority in my work. I used to focus on international humanitarian law, specifically when it comes to medicine and access to drugs, especially in African countries. That was 20 years ago. 20 years later, collaborating with the manager of Doctors Without Borders for 9 years, we worked together on a study case about intellectual property of drugs, which was impeding the access to COVID-19 treatments. And the link between the World Trade Organization and the lack of consistency with the World Health Organization. There was a very tricky system of access to COVID-19 treatments because of some countries denying the access to treatments based on intellectual property rules. So as I'm talking to you now, it's really difficult for me to be optimistic for the future. But as a philosopher, and it's probably because of this expertise that I can speak today, I think we should remain vigilant when it comes to ethical and commercial aspects. When we were in the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, there was this competition for vaccines coming from many countries. However, we need to remain hopeful because we do not have much other option. We need to act, we need to mobilize action, and the more action we trigger, the more capable we will be to overcome some obstacles. We will celebrate the 85th anniversary of the right of good health, in 2026. And I think it's the best time for humanitarian stakeholders to shed light on the unconditional aspect of good health access. More specifically, when it comes to the security to make health services a secure asset for everyone. And when I'm speaking of security, I mean access to hospital, access to drugs. And it's important to emphasize the work that has been done towards children and vulnerable communities, caregivers. It's a paramount importance to give access to health security to everyone.
Merci beaucoup, Rioa.
Thank you very much, Rioa.
Pardonnerai, mais je ne résiste pas à parler du
We can now go, we can have a word about the book from Frederick.
Paradigme de réalisme politique. C'est un très bon livre et qui, je pense, pour les, on va dire, ceux qui sont vraiment intéressés, la Croix-Rouge en faire partie, à cet paradigme d'idéalisme aussi. Ça propose aussi des pistes intéressantes.
Thank you very much for those comments.
Alors, Monsieur le discutant, je vous laisse prendre la relève sur les questions.
I'm going to hand you over to the next speaker concerning the different questions that have been asked in the Zoom call and also here in the room. So because we are here together until 5 minutes past 12, I'm just negotiating with my colleague if we could go until 12:05 instead of 12 o'clock.
Merci beaucoup. D'abord, je voudrais dire que
Thank you. I'd like to start off by saying that I was very interested by these four perspectives.
Qui m'ont amené à un raisonnement finalement logique de proche en proche. D'abord, j'observe que
I can see that among these four of these speakers, we have a historian, a philosopher, and a professor of humanitarian studies, and a president of the Red Cross out in the field. So that shows that there is a certain preoccupation about what we call the humanities here within the context of humanitarian action. It's interesting because let's not forget that just a few months ago at the Academy of Medicine, I triggered a 2-year program entitled General Knowledge and Medicine. The idea being that one of the factors of medical dehumanization today is the lack of general knowledge, the lack of knowledge about historical references and language, and of course, sociological and anthropological knowledge. And I think that this work can perfectly be applied to the humanitarian sector as well. Just a precise example of this, Ebola, you mentioned this yourself. When our teams arrived in the forests of Guinea, they were welcomed with guns, bows, and arrows, of course. And they stepped back and they regrouped and said, well, what do we do? Well, it was problematic, and we asked an Ivory Coast anthropologue to join us to carry out some work to try and understand what was going on. And after a few months of interesting work, he came back to us and said, you can't be surprised at this. When you arrive, you get the person who's sick and you isolate them. Whereas here, the sick person is looked after by their family. We don't isolate. That's the first one. The second, you say you're going to feed the sick person and not the family, not the tribe. That is part of their duty. They have to feed and look after the poor person. And when the person dies, well, you zip him up in a body bag and you completely forget the funeral rites of the tribes. So that shows that you don't know them and they don't know you either. So it's easy to understand straight away what's going wrong. And I think that everybody who has to go out into the field in certain countries, you need training courses to have some ideas of psychology, philosophy, history, and anthropology of these different countries in order to carry out the right actions. The first question I asked was quite simple. Can you make the difference between humanism, humanity, and the humanities? A lot of people, not many people could give a good answer to that question. So this is the question that I'm going to ask Dorothea and also to our philosopher and our historians. They will be able to add the words. Are you teaching future humanities? And what would you think of including in your training sessions? I'm not talking about creating a dictionary, but to give them certain references. Have you already thought of this? And if not, do you think that this could be very interesting to include this in your training courses? And finally, from what I've seen, in Burundi, and I take my hats off to them, and the Red Cross in Burundi is really wonderful. I've been there, and it is a wonderful Red Cross center. 61% Catholics and 39% Protestants, so not many problems there. But I then turned to Anisette in Ivory Coast. Apparently, there are 42% Muslim and 34% Christians. Are they working in the same associations? Or are there certain movements which have a religious leaning? Once again, the statistics were in Burundi were 61% Christian and 39% Muslim. So that's the question I wanted to ask. Dorothea?
Moi, la question ne m'a pas été posée. Parce qu'on dit qu'au Burundi, il n'y a pas de
in Burundi, we don't have this segregation. Yes, so it was 60% Catholic and 40% Protestant. So it's all Christian here. So our Red Cross in Burundi, everyone is working together. But you still have this challenge, no? Of violence between Tutsi and Tutsi. This still exists, despite the reconciliation that has taken place. But there is less and less today. Everybody has understood that we have known war, October 1993, and that lasted more than 8 years. And that was following on the assassination of the Hutu president. There were guerrillas, there were exiles, it was terrible. We had segregation within the towns and villages, also for the buses. There was segregation everywhere. Public transport, as I said, separating the two ethnic groups. Schools were closed, markets were closed, churches were closed. But we've understood that both of those two ethnic groups lost out in this war. So this is why things are better now, because people realize that neither of those groups were on the winning side. We are together. We are helping each other. You have mixed marriages now between the Hutu and the Tutsi. Before that simply wasn't possible. So now we can see a certain unity within our country.
Merci beaucoup, Christine. Peut-être Théa, est-ce que vous êtes prête à répondre?
Dorothea or Anissé, would you like to answer?
Oui.
Si j'ai bien compris, vous m'avez demandé aussi.
You've asked me to be more precise about how I can see humanism within the humanities. Is that right?
Et je trouve
I can't say one way or the other, but I can say that it is important. We've been talking a lot about what is neutrality, what is independence in the previous years. But I think we have to ask ourselves, what are the key values? What are the values of humanity? Because that's at the heart of humanitarian aid. And I think there are lots of challenges to face. More and more people are saying, well, yeah, you're right. People should be equal within their lives. You've spoken about the amount of suffering, however, that we do not see. People suffer in silence. Some crises get more media coverage than others. The crisis that continue with refugees coming to Europe, that also creates a lot of questions about what is the value of their lives, of their humanity when they come to Europe. And that does polarize our societies to a certain extent. It's not only important, but urgent to continue thinking along these lines. It's up to all of us, I think, to think about the definition of Thomas Mann about humanism that may give us a certain direction in our discussions. Humanism is maybe a more political value than the desire of simply wanting to help people, because it's the dignity of humanity that is in question here. And that's what we see. What we see when we have a more united front. I can repeat that in English if you like, if it's not clear enough. Anissé, over to you. It's always a pleasure to be here next to you and learning from you. When we hear you speak, it has a hugely positive impact. So to answer your question, I'm going to start off with question 2. That's to say the question about Christians and Muslims in Ivory Coast work together. The Ivory Coast is a secular country, first and foremost. But in everyday lives, we do work together fine. In the humanitarian movement, there is a rule that is followed, and that's for NGOs, associations, charities. They're always mixed. You do have uniquely Christian or uniquely Muslim associations who work each to their own side, but essentially it is mixed. So the NGOs that I mentioned earlier are the visible part of the iceberg. So once again, we don't have problems in the Ivory Coast of any competition between Christian and Muslim societies because, as I said, those individual societies or charities work on their own, but the majority are mixed Muslims and Christians because it's a secular country. I'm a historian. I wouldn't call that a handicap. And I've worked on the history of AIDS in the Ivory Coast. I have been described by historians as a Christian who's been baptized by an imam. So people would say, are you a sociologue or are you a historian? Certain sociologues didn't recognize me. They thought that I was just a hybrid historian and sociologist and anthropologist as well. So I had to justify myself everywhere I went. And I still have to justify things more than anybody else, justify what I can bring to the table as a historian. Often people say, you are, as a historian, what can you bring? So for me, I would think that is sometimes a little handicap that people label me as a mere historian. So I have the opportunity to teach at the human rights in the University of Ivory Coast. So there's a specific module there about humanitarian work that I teach. The students and participants could be young people, political leaders, young political leaders, NGOs as well, charities. And this covers a number of different subjects, whether it be AIDS, Ebola, or COVID-19. I think we're going to take 3 questions from the floor.
Il y a le temps que les questions montent. En général, il faut quelques secondes pour qu'elles bourgeonnent. Donc, ça y est.
So, questions from the room.
Madame professeur Dan Ferrand-Bechman.
Bonjour. Je voulais dire à quel
I
point
would
je
just
suis
like to say
sensible
how
à
sensitive
thématique
I am to Mr.
sur
Matei's remarks about the
de
importance of
formation anthropologie qui s'oriente
proposing
différemment.
anthropological
Mais c'est
training
vrai aussi en
courses.
France. J'ai pris
It's
pas mal
not
de
only
sociologie,
in Africa, it's in France as
en
well.
médecine, c'est pas du tout évident que les voilà. Et ensuite, il se trouve à face des
Sometimes
patients musulmans, des
doctors
patients
in
qui viennent
France
de
are
Polynésie,
looking after Muslims or
de
people from
pays
Polynesia who
justement
have very
justement où
different
la famille se
approaches.
développe mal. Je veux
Their
dire,
family is
c'est très
supposed to be there. So
difficile
I think
même en France.
that this is
Donc,
lacking
je
in
crois qu'il
mainland France as well as in
faut quand
Africa.
même voir le travail qu'a fait Nathan, qui peut quand même aider à comprendre l'intérêt d'une étude ethno-méthodologique, je dirais.
So there's no question in that.
Justement un spécialiste des
Here we have a specialist in human rights, in funeral rights during the Ebola crisis. My question is for Anissé. Earlier, when you gave an example of the teaching that is done,
il a parlé du cas de c'est dans un centre privé. Alors, j'aimerais poser la question de savoir pour
I'd
vous
like to
qui
ask
êtes
you the question. You are a teacher
dans
in the public sector.
Est-ce que vous avez
Have you had the opportunity
de faire ces enseignements dans l'espace public? Sinon, qu'est-ce qui fait que vous ne partagez pas en fait ces expériences?
Can you share some of your experiences within the public university?
Merci. Je vais juste compléter donc avec 2 questions.
There are 2
ligne,
questions also online.
Une première pour tout le monde, comment les
How can humanitarian stakeholders maintain their ethics following the large number of conflicts on one hand, but also certain phenomena, fake information, fake news as well, that they have to face as well?
Sur le respect des principes humanitaires.
That's the first question. The second question concerns Mr. Matei's inaugural speech. How can we guarantee autonomy of the public when we have a certain asymmetry between the necessary expertise in complex humanitarian situations and we are faced with the non-expertise of the people suffering these disasters? If there is a third question, that would be great, and we will finish after those.
Donc on va partir sur ces 2 questions. Peut-être Rioa, vous n'êtes pas intervenu, ça vous dit de
Would you like to answer one of those questions? Yes, I will answer. I would like to reply to the comment of Mr. Matei. I teach in Canada. Ethical lessons are mandatory, and we have more and more work being done on that. What about the intercultural aspect? Well, yes, that's true, but also it's more specific, I think. We're all trying to learn more together as a society, but within the medicine faculty, I would say that the historical responsibility is clearly there. And it's up to the institution, the hospital, to take responsibility. I'm very also happy to see that in France, humanity is included in the sector of medical studies. If we try to help understanding, well, what is universal moralism? Well, back in the day, for all kinds of reasons, we thought that understanding the rights of man was something that was well under control, and Kant did that in his philosophy. But that's not necessarily the case today anymore. We can look at the intercultural or transcultural aspect as well. And this of a specific conception of the fundamental rights of humanity, which do not depend on certain metaphysical beliefs or religious beliefs either. So the idea to say, or to recognize plural multiculturalism, but this can bring on moral scepticism as well. So the recognition of this cultural plurality does not mean that we give up on our universal morality. We mentioned the funeral rites during the Ebola crisis, and that's a very clear example of how we can take into account cultural specificities when it comes to respecting the dignity and the human rights of the people that we are helping. There's one approach which we call basic rights. This idea that there are basic rights of all humans, which condition the possibilities of exercising all the other rights, rights to security, rights to food. What are the basic capacities which enable us to carry out our human rights in a free way? This fundamental capacity of all children, regardless of their cultural conditions, to be able to play, to not be slaves or child soldiers or hostages. We have to think about moral universalism and not give up on a universal conception of human rights.
Getting back to the Firmin's question about the University of Bouaké, where I teach. I would like to quote a community saying that says that you should not get out in the courtyard to attend a show which can be seen from your house. Why don't we teach some subject matters in our public university? It's basically because we need to justify, to legitimize what's important and what's not. In July, last July, I have now been nominated as a research manager I worked on two different theses, one that was targeting mental disorders, and the second one was on child healthcare in Côte d'Ivoire country, because most of the time there are some traditional beliefs that as soon as you have access to newborns healthcare, you are labeled as black magic or bad luck families, and we are trying hard to educate people on what are obstetric healthcare and how we can give access to specific families. And those two theses were confirmed and completed recently. These summaries were even presented in the Ministry of Health of the country. So these are two examples of useful projects that we led to open up horizons in our university. Moving forward with Dorothea, I'm very happy to see the number of people who are connected online from different countries. Getting back to the question about misinformation, I can remember working on the DRC within our research program. Nurses and doctors were seen as disease conveyors and not caregivers. And we faced a lack of information and understanding when it in the aspect of medicine and humanitarian aid. There is a crucial lack of information and understanding from the local population and we need to focus on educating people or sharing relevant information, especially when it comes to medicine and disease and epidemics. Thank you. I will not add too many things. Our humanities is always aiming at alleviating pain, impeding population to suffer, alleviating pains among vulnerable communities through transparency, communication, information. And that's why it's really important to communicate on what we do, how we do it. Local people need us, need you to be humble. They going through very hard time and difficult conditions. So we need to maintain their dignity and we need to respect them for the human beings that they are. I think it's a very interesting conclusion to remain humble and to pursue our efforts with dignity. We could carry on for a long time talking about humanities and humanism. However, I think it's time to wrap up this session because we move forward with master students. Thank you all. Thank you, Dorothea, Christine, Anise, and Raiwa for coming here today. I know you're not living in Paris, so it was a long trip for you. I will give the floor to Julien Antoli, who will
Merci Virginie, merci
the remaining part of the session. Thank you, Virginie. For this last part of the morning session, we wanted to give the opportunity to students
pour engager les étudiants du master
especially
Human Rights and
students from the
Humanitarian Action.
Master
On a travaillé
in
depuis un
Human
mois
Rights and
avec eux, donc je
Humanitarian
les inviter
Action
à
from
nous
the
rejoindre sur
International
scène.
Affairs
Et
School,
je voulais remercier particulièrement
we
le
have
docteur
worked
Hamakarouf, qui a
with
participé à la
Dr.
fois en tant
Hamakarouf
que
for 1 month
participante au comité
as
scientifique
part
de la
of the
conférence, mais aussi
scientific
encadré cette
committee
mission
and
étudiante. Donc je
also
vais présenter
as
en quelques
part of
mots
this
la manière dont les étudiants
student-led
ont abordé le futur.
work.
Et ensuite, on les laissera faire leur prestation avant de partir
And
déjeuner aux
I
enfants.
will give the floor to Rada.
Merci Julien. C'est une très
Thank
belle
you,
occasion
Julien. It's a great opportunity today to get together in this campus to advocate the humanitarian action. It's a rare opportunity actually to emphasize this collaboration between Sciences Po and the Red Cross Foundation. I, as a teacher, I was part of this project working with master degree students as an introduction to humanitarian law. So we work together through, based on my field experiences, working with the International Committee of Red Cross and as a volunteer in Red Cross France. We have worked on an anticipatory scenario from the youth perspective. So we will jump in the future, in 27 years from now, in an imaginary territory, in an imaginary space and time. So we are in 2050. We are based in Tarakara, and we will listen to a famous journalist who will present us what's going on in 2050 in this region of the world.
My name is Giordano Cani. I'm a Sciences Po student in the first year of the Master of Human Rights and Humanitarian Action, as they have introduced. And today, thanks to la Fondation de la Croix-Rouge Française, together with my fellow students that I'm going to present in 1 second, we are here to share, to express our point of view on the current humanitarian transition. And we thought that the best way to do it was by taking you into the future. Let me explain. You are going to attend a fictional scenario that we have imagined taking place into the future, in the year 2050. We imagined a context of crisis in the year 2050, where in a fictional imaginary region of the world that we called Tarakara, a dreadful earthquake has impacted the region, followed by a destructive tsunami, and this region have been also the theater of clashes among armed groups. Now you might be thinking, but this is nothing new. There is no different from the situations and the news that we might be listening today. True. The goal of our imaginary scenario is to reflect on the evolution of the humanitarian responses to this crisis. We want to understand what are the old and the new means to respond to natural disaster and to conflicts, highlighting the flaws that we see in the present and the possible solution that we imagine for the future. To do that, we are going to impersonate different actors of the humanitarian sector that can give various perspectives on this evolution in the 2050. Nathan here is going to be the Secretary General of the World Organization. Molly is going to be an NGO worker. Stephanie is going to be the President of Nordovia, a delegated country from the global north. Annabelle is going to be the President of Sudovia, a delegated country from the global south. And Hannah is going to be an academic researcher. My role will be to question them as a journalist. And that said, with no further ado, let's jump all together into the future and welcome everyone to the 2050 Roundtable on the State of Humanitarian Practice. Mr. Charles, you're here as Secretary General of the World Organization, let's start with you. And dramatic pictures as those that we have seen behind us have become more and more frequent than in the past. And so my first question for you is, from your perspective, what have been the most important ways in which we have adapted to this incremental ecological breakdown?
Thank you very much for the question. Obviously, it's a massive question, and I think that maybe the best way to kick off this roundtable is for me to offer my perspective as the Secretary General of the World Organization, looking at how we got here to 2050 by, analyzing some trends in humanitarian action and identifying where we found shortcomings that we're working to overcome. I don't think I need to convince any of you here that humanitarian cooperation must be as vertical as it is horizontal. We obviously have a wide range of actors presented at this table from across the sector, but at the same time, it's important that these conversations happen all the way from the international down to the hyper-local level. Of course, this is not a new idea. We've been talking about this message of localization for quite some time. But I think the truth is that for a long time it was unfulfilled, the promise of localization. And where we fell short, I think, is in trying to actually transform the system as a whole. While we may have introduced different ideas and put more attention on efforts to localize, the system as a whole remained the same for a very long time. But now I'm very happy to say, in the last 30 years or so, we've been really making efforts to change this narrative. And I want to highlight here the introduction of the International Humanitarian Action Research Clinics. We have a representative with us today. And these networks, they've been a great opportunity to link local research communities into the greater humanitarian system. And it's very important here for myself and others coming from a global perspective to understand that we don't have all the answers when it comes to a crisis like in Terracar, where what we're talking about today. And it's very important that we leverage the local experts from these regions who have the greatest ability to shape policies and the direction of humanitarian action for the future. And so now by leveraging these networks, I think we start at a much better place to prepare for emergencies and to respond to needs. And this is in large part thanks to coordination between the World Organization, as well as state ministries, NGOs, even the private sector with these academic researchers. So for the past 10 years since I took the role of Secretary General, I've been advocating for the development and integration of these research networks all across the system. And I think only then are we better equipped to utilize our shared capacities in approaching issues like environmental resilience, which is especially prevalent today.
Thank you. And now I will leave the floor then to Professor Miller so that she can share her academic point of view on the establishment of this research clinics network.
Thank you. So thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for introducing me. I head the International Humanitarian Action Research Clinics, which is a circle of academics. I'm proud to say that we have over 120 research clinics in different countries worldwide, where researchers are able to conduct research in their own context, whether that be socioeconomical, political, geographical. And I think this has really helped to create not just a better understanding of what humanitarian work is, but a better understanding of how we can conduct it and a greater respect for international humanitarian law. I'd like to pick up on what you said about the environment, because I think this is a perfect way of seeing how research has helped to improve the way that we conduct humanitarian action. whether that be sort of emergency preparedness with landslide prevention measures, disaster response with significantly more localized aid and aid materials, or rebuilding, where we're offering clean energy solutions that are protecting from energy vulnerability. We're creating long-term solutions for people who would previously have been in a situation of energy dependence, potentially. We have to remember that the natural disasters that we knew in our youth are unrecognizable. They're happening more and more often and in much more violent ways, and that's before any other compounding factors like armed conflict or violence. We have to respond accordingly.
Thank you, Professor Miller. And yes, the world in 2050 is more fragile. And I cannot but wonder, could we do more and what could we do better? For example, Mrs. Renaud, President of Sudovia. How would you comment the common claim that global South countries have not done enough to the green transition?
That's a good question. I think obviously the past fundamental issues was the funding and the investment to manage and resolve environmental crises, especially in like a sustainable way. But we achieved to get equal distribution of the funds, adapted to each local and cultural context of each country and also their capacities. And also, I think global north, if I'm right, global north countries switch their perspective and their approach by considering differences, if I may say.
So thank you. And indeed, there is, we know the creation of the Common Humanitarian Fund that improved a lot the humanitarian intervention. Obviously, I'm conscious that global north countries have much more financial funds and invest considerably in RD&D than those in the global south. But that is why the Common Humanitarian Fund is now also mandatory, especially for global north countries. I mean, we all know that the Common Humanitarian Fund also works like this. Every country provide according to their GDP. And this international fund has different functions. First, we know that the common fund is for collective RD&D, but it is also a fund that helps NGOs because we all know that they also encounter a lot of financial issues. Indeed, we have established since the Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul in 2016 that 25% should be reserved for NGOs to help them. And obviously the main goal of the fund is to be used by countries that are most in need for environmental improvement to resist the increasing climate breakdown.
Thank you. I think like financial resources from global north countries strengthen the distribution of the fund for research and development. But also the Humanitarian Summit of Istanbul helped to allow more resources for action of local actors. It's obvious. But there is also the collaboration with like an international organization that is deciding of the distribution of the fund impartially and according to the emergency of the crisis. I think it's one of the main achievements that we have done since the 2 decades. But global south countries also have the fear to be dependent on the most important donors of the funds and to enter into a survival economy. I think we have to improve and focus more strengthening national law, even if we know that the funds help us to create new law, new strategies, new responses, and that are adapted on researchers' conclusion. But we have to be more independent, create our new way.
So if I might jump, I just want to stress out that there has been also the creation of the Convention on the Respect for Ecosystem that was created in 2035. And this treaty has offered significant progress. At the time of drafting this convention, we had observed a critical need to develop a treaty that was broad enough to encompass all countries, but that was also specific enough to target the need of individual countries.
That's true. Convention on Respect for Ecosystem is a strong help, but the fact is still the same. International law is truly influenced by countries and regional organizations that have an important economic and social power. For us, as global South countries, we have important challenge. We have to manage and find sustainable solution in order to improve responses to environmental crisis, but also create new strategies on climate change and on the impact that government, local actors such as NGOs, researchers have when they are acting on the field, but also when they are doing research and trying to improve.
Obviously, I understand your legitimate concern, and I do think further discussion is obviously needed as the humanitarian field is continuously evolving. But I also feel that this discussion should take place in the next humanitarian summit, which is in 3 months. I'm sure that each country and a lot of NGOs have a lot of issues and need solution as soon as possible.
Thanks to both of you for this debate. It is important to understand all points of view on this matter. And to conclude this first round, I will ask to Mrs. Whitney, as NGO worker, what is the position of NGOs in this debate?
Thank you. No, I have one here. As a representative of Green Circle, an NGO committed to fighting the effects of climate change, we naturally believe that if we are to make generalizations about the global north and the global south, perhaps the president of Moldova should take more of a financial responsibility, especially given Moldova's disproportionate role in contributing towards climate crises such as the one we're dealing with right now. So in that respect, that would be our perspective. In terms of what our NGO is doing ourselves to prevent disasters such as this from happening again, we have decided to take responsibility for our own CO2 emissions. We do not need to fly anywhere. We do not need to take flights. And we've been able to do this in 2050 because we have managed to build local capacity so well to such an extent that we can manage everything electronically from a distance. In terms of what we're doing on a more local conservational level, we are currently lobbying governments to implement more demining programs, which will increase biodiversity post-conflict very quickly and will also allow local communities to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Whitney. And so, as we have seen that in 2050, the world is more ecologically fragile, but the world in 2050 is also far more technological than 27 years ago. And so my question is, how has the humanitarian response practice changed due to this technological progress?
I think if I may jump in here, when we talk about technology, I think we have to think about two strands to these improvements. Firstly, technology in the old sense, i.e. autonomous but not necessarily intelligent, and now artificial intelligence. I think I need to stress this again, that the technology of our youth has completely changed. And we've become more and more reliant on technology in humanitarian action. That's not to say that there aren't positives. There are absolutely positives. I'm going to focus specifically on AI. it is helping us to identify, to sort through, to draw inferences from data at speeds that we would never have been able to do as humans. It's helping us to map crises, and it's also helping us to identify future disasters. It's a huge, huge asset for problem solving, but also for rapid response. But, and I think this is a huge caveat, academia has been warning against the dangers and the potential shortcomings of AI for over 35 years. Algorithmic bias is still an issue. That's due to the origin, but also the refinement of data sets that are used in AI training. When we're talking about humanitarian work, we are working with people, but most importantly, we are working with their trust. And as such, I think we have to be incredibly careful with the way that we use their information, the way that we collect, that we store their information. We're seeing more and more cyber attacks on humanitarian aid organizations. We are prime targets. We have lots of data about civilians, about potentially vulnerable populations. And as such, I think we have to protect that and build solutions that protect from surveillance, from monitoring, from intrusion. That is done by including engineers, including computer scientists, including data scientists into the creation of our humanitarian action responses.
Thank you, Professor Miller. As you confirmed, our world in 2050 is more technological. We are increasingly dependent on technology, but then doesn't this mean that people now, in the future, are even more vulnerable than before?
In some ways, yes, that's certainly a concern. But I'd like to start with some brief good news, if I may. You know, as we just heard, technology is much different now. And not only this, but we have so many more experts in the humanitarian field, working in the humanitarian field, that specifically specialize in data collection, geospatial mapping, and analysis of all of this, these new amounts of data. And so what this ends up meaning from a logistics point of view is that for every dollar put into the humanitarian system, more of it is reaching the ground level, the beneficiary level. And I think that that's very important to recognize. Now back to your question, there are certainly a plethora of new risks that are introduced. I want to pick up a little bit on what was said about cyber warfare just earlier. You know, we're seeing more and more cyber attacks as parts of armed conflict nowadays. And while this may lead to reduced civilian casualties, from direct attacks, if a power grid or a water supply system is compromised, then the long-term consequences of civilian livelihood can be very severe. And I think here we can also see how technology directly intersects with the depletion of natural resources, which has been a very troubling issue of this century due to climate change. We were seeing communities more and more dependent on the effective coordination and distribution of basic goods, food, water, energy, basic human rights, that, like I said, become more vulnerable during cyber warfare. And so this is why the Convention on the Respect for Ecosystems, which has been mentioned already in 2035, was a very big deal. It extended the status of protected civilian property to include essential infrastructure, like those power grids or water treatment centers that I mentioned before. And not only this, it importantly includes specific language on cyber attacks and cyber warfare that make it unlawful to conduct this type of activity when it would negatively impact civilian populations. And so I really, really emphasize the importance that future treaties and agreements follow this lead in identifying spaces where technology has the potential to create serious human harm.
Thank you. It's also worth noting that NGOs such as Green Circle have been putting pressure on states to promote the protection of critical infrastructure, which has now been considered a war crime for many years as of 2030. We are also working with governments and experts to develop drones to actually deter potential aggressors from attacking power grids and water supply facilities. So this is an exciting technological advancement which is helping us in the field. The creation of a digital emblem 20 years ago has proved successful in serving as a way of promoting safeguarding for medical facilities. However, we are still in the process of encouraging global actors to respect the values of the emblem. Now, today, we are working with universities to develop not just a symbolic value of the emblem, but to actually give it qualities of protection. So we look forward to a future where a digital emblem can actually deflect cyber attacks instead of just, from potential aggressors. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. And approaching a conclusion, because also in the future people have need for a break. One final question, if I may. We have talked about environment, technology, and humanitarian action. So my question is, to what extent do you think that these three issues have become more and more interconnected now in the future?
So I think that in order to provide relief from environmental disaster, technology is a key role. That is why the global north countries have shared a lot their scientific knowledge, but also their technology. So obviously the right to science has been expanded much more also thanks to the Convention on the Respect for Ecosystem. And obviously the Common Humanitarian Fund also improved the overall financial issues that we had decades ago. However, I'm obviously conscious there is still a lot of issues that need to be targeted, which also will be discussed in the next Humanitarian Summit that is in 3 months.
Thank you. I think from my point of view, of course, there have been like a lot of achievements, but there will still need to have improvement. And I think one of the main improvement is what Professor Miller highlights just before. That is, we need to include more actors in the development, the expansion of the access, and the good use of technology in the humanitarian action responses. We also need to create more sustainable cooperation between actors, especially on technology that is evolving really fast and that is playing a key role. And we have to strengthen common and national strategies to manage according to each economic and development capacities of each country to provide a better world for tomorrow.
Thanks to both of you. And I think that with this, we can draw our conclusion. So today we have tried to show that the humanitarian action in 2050 in the future, I've said these words I don't know how many times, look different than in the past, and that's not a surprise. But thanks to this roundtable, I think that 3 key factors have emerged. First, the humanitarian transition has succeeded in achieving a deeper collaboration among all the new international actors. And I think that the composition of this roundtable may be the first and most eloquent proof of that. On the other hand, another accomplishment has been the maintaining of a human-centered approach on the humanitarian response in a more localized responsibility, and we have seen it also, and it was pleasant to see that in the previous roundtable. But one last factor is that all of this was possible only through a new balance, a new fair balance in the North-South collaboration, as we have seen. So that said, I want to thank you all for your participation here today. I think it may be a good idea to meet again 20 years from now. Let's see how the interaction will be changed once again. I want to thank you all for your participation. I want to thank you, the foundation, and if you allow us, we want to thank our professor, Rana Karoufa. I will kindly invite here because we have a little present.
On peut les applaudir. Bravo.